Hello and welcome to Health Affairs This Week. I'm your host, Jeff Byers. We are recording on February 11th, 2026. So last month, HHS revised the U.S. dietary guidelines. It prioritized protein among other dietary suggestions, de-emphasized health equity, and promoted reduced health spending through dietary choices. Today, to discuss those guidelines, we have registered dietitian nutritionalist from Wellness and Sports Dietetics, Jenny Lowe. Coming in live from the 7 Fight 7. Jenny, welcome to the program.
Hey, thank you so much.
Yeah, so for people that might not know, what is a dietitian and how does it fit into the healthcare landscape?
Sure. So registered dietitians are the nutrition experts in the United States. So a lot of people have heard the term nutritionist, but they have not heard the term registered dietitian. In the United States, the term nutritionist is not a regulated term. So anybody can call themselves a nutritionist with or without any form of education. Whereas a registered dietitian, we are the medical experts in nutrition therapy for humans. So we undergo a lot of schooling, we undergo supervised practice, and we have to take a medical licensing exam, just like all your other healthcare professionals.
Well, fantastic. So, getting into the meat of the conversation, pun intended, from a broad sense, what were the changes that were made to the U.S. nutrition dietary guidelines?
Yeah, so the meat and potatoes of the dietary guidelines remain grossly the same, with the exception of just a couple of items. So those things that have changed are our alcohol intake recommendations, our protein intake recommendations, and then our language surrounding the consumption of highly processed foods. So for the alcohol intake recommendations, the previous guidelines had suggested a maximum intake amount. So we actually had some guardrails up recommending a reduction in alcohol intake. The new guidelines literally just say, quote, consume less alcohol. This is problematic because this is in conflict with what some of our recent health organizations have come out with. So in 2025, the American Heart Association and the World Health Organization came out and said that there is no acceptable intake for alcohol in order for it to be health promoting. So basically they say, don't drink at all. Whereas these guys are saying, just drink less. It'll be fine. We then have changes to our protein recommendations. So the previous guidelines set an RDA for protein, and the RDA is the recommended dietary allowance. The RDA is meant to meet the needs of 98% of Americans. And that RDA was set at 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight.
What does that mean?
So that means that 98% of Americans will be okay if they eat 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram of body weight.
What is interesting, so I'm already hearing some math in there. Like, yes. What might you say to a client of yours if they want to know that in layman's terms?
Yeah, so in layman's terms, I typically use a plate and guide my clients to eat according to the proportions on their plate. So I say about a quarter to a third of the plate as your protein item.
Okay. And what else? What are the other changes that we have?
So the protein recommendation is now almost doubled.
Okay.
So the new recommendations, we have a range of protein, which is 1.2 to 1.6 grams per kilogram of body weight, which kind of, as you mentioned, like, first of all, that's very hard to teach. But then number two, that is almost double what we were doing currently. And if we knew that 0.8 grams a kilogram would meet 98% of the population's needs, this recommendation may be much higher than what the majority of people need. It's also notable, so that term RDA that I described, that is a technical term that is used to enforce policy, or our food policy. And this is not explicitly stated if this is an RDA. So this is kind of thrown out there as like, people should eat more protein. However, we're supposed to be using the dietary guidelines to influence policy. And without having this term, the RDA, it makes it almost impossible to use this updated protein recommendation in order to inform policy.
Okay. And I have no follow-up on that. So what about the ultra-processed stuff?
So the ultra-processed foods. So the previous guidelines, if you were to eat the way they recommended, you weren't going to be eating a whole lot of processed foods to begin with. However, our new guidelines has very explicit language surrounding ultra-processed foods. The new guidelines say avoid highly processed, packaged, prepared, or ready to eat foods. This is problematic because we do not have a definition of what ultra processed or highly processed foods are. It's kind of that I'll know it when I see it sort of thing. And again, that makes it almost impossible to use this to inform policy because it's based on personal judgment. RFK Jr. did state that he was going to come up with a definition of ultra processed foods. However, he did not do that. He just listed the ingredients that are commonly found in ultra processed foods, and again, making it nearly impossible to form any sort of policy based on this recommendation.
When I look at the press release, I see the main things that they're trying to emphasize from the administration: prioritizing protein, avoiding highly processed foods, avoiding added sugars. They say ending the war on healthy fats, heralding whole grains, and avoiding refined carbohydrates, and including diets lower in carbohydrates to manage chronic disease. From like just a person who's not a nutritionalist and dietitian, like that seems pretty good to me. So like I'm not allowed to have an opinion on these as a podcaster, but like, what are your reactions to these?
So the dietary guidelines has two different sets of documents. We have the graphic, which that you guys have seen. It's the new, we brought the food pyramid back, we flipped it upside down, and then we put animal products at the top, plus like a giant piece of broccoli for whatever reason. And then we have the text. The text is directed to the professionals, it's directed to policymakers and healthcare providers. The text is like mostly the same. So like it's like fine. But again, nutrition is nuanced. And so we have these things that are talking about changes in protein recommendations, changes in saturated fat recommendations. That becomes problematic for us. But really the issue is we have this teaching graphic that is not in line with what the document actually states. And honestly, at the end of the day, most Americans do not eat according to the dietary guidelines. They eat according to what tastes good, what's affordable to them, and what they have access to. Where this becomes an issue or becomes problematic is the fact that this document is meant to inform our food policy. Because this document is not as specific as previous documents were, so we don't have the RDAs listed here, because we don't have definitions for a lot of the things that they're trying to enforce, this becomes very difficult when we want it to influence policy on our food systems.
Okay. And speaking of, food policy on the food systems, before we started recording, you were talking about the background of the creation of dietary guidelines. Can you go into a little bit of that?
Yeah. The Dietary Guidelines for Americans is a set of guidelines created to help inform nutrition professionals, healthcare professionals, and policymakers on what the latest recommendations are for health promoting nutrition. In addition to the text, so the text is geared towards the professionals, we have those graphics that I had mentioned. And those graphics are used to teach the public what the documents actually state. These guidelines, which have been in existence since the 1980s, are updated every 5 years. About 2 years prior to their update, a team of experts are nominated either by the public or by professional organizations to serve on what is called the Dietary Advisory Committee. This committee combs over all of the latest nutrition research and forms a document in order to advise on the next iteration of the dietary guidelines. These individuals do not get any sort of compensation or any sort of funding to serve on this committee, and historically they have not received any funding from industry that would be considered a conflict of interest. This review did happen. This document was given to RFK Jr., was given to the Health and Human Services Department. However, he rejected the committee's report and decided to form his own advisory committee. It's important to note that 8 out of 9 of the experts on this panel, this new panel, have some sort of compensation or receive some sort of funding from the meat industry, the egg industry, or the dairy industry. And many of them also sit on the board of or have received funding from a lot of our low-carb diet industry leaders like the Atkins Foundation. It's important to keep this in mind as we go over these dietary guidelines.
And so there is a bit from the agency that the new food pyramid is affordable. From your perspective, have you heard anything about that? And what's your perspective? You talked about affordability of like Americans will buy what is affordable and what tastes good. So, like, from your perspective on affordability of food, you know, how do the new guidelines look, or like what do you know based on your clients?
Yeah, so the short answer is no, these dietary guidelines are not going to be affordable for millions of Americans. And this is based off of the fact that animal protein sources are going to be more expensive. We are facing a rising cost of food in our country as well. And then we couple this with the extensive cuts that we're seeing in our SNAP benefits. So, SNAP is formerly the food stamp program, and there's been a lot of cuts with that, making access to food more difficult for millions of Americans.
Okay. We talked about what you thought was good or bad in your view about the guidelines. You noted some things that you thought were problematic. Is there anything that you like is to celebrate in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, since the meat and potatoes of the guidelines are mostly the same, like that's fantastic. We're still recommending high intakes of vegetables. We're still recommending high intakes of fruit, still recommending whole grains, still recommending reducing added sugars. And all of those things are very health promoting. So those are definitely wins with this document.
Yeah. We also talked about before we started recording the potential downstream effects of the guidelines, and you did mention that ambiguity. So, like, is there anything you want to highlight there?
Yeah, for better or for worse, most Americans don't eat according to the dietary guidelines. So the ambiguity that we're seeing with this is probably not going to affect the majority of Americans. But who it is going to affect is those individuals who are impacted by our food policies. So if we need to use this document to make changes in our food policy, that's going to become very difficult, and that's going to limit access to food for millions of people. Again, especially because our individuals who are at most at risk, getting our SNAP benefits, our national school lunch program, any sort of food assistant program, if we were to cut out those highly processed foods, which are packaged, affordable, and easy to prepare, we can be cutting out millions of calories across the nation, which is not necessarily a good thing.
Anything else in the guidelines that we haven't talked about that you want to touch on?
Yeah, so there's one recommendation regarding the saturated fat intake that's kind of interesting to discuss. So, the previous dietary guidelines recommended less than 10% of your daily calories coming from saturated fats. So, like 200 calories on a 2,000 calorie diet should be coming from saturated fat, no more than that. The new guidelines in the text of it still states that. So it still says less than 10% of your daily calories should come from saturated fats. However, if you were to eat the way that inverted food pyramid is suggesting, you would easily go over that 10% of your calories from saturated fat. And that's because this new food pyramid is leaning much more heavily on high fat animal products. So there's a little bit of ambiguity with that one as well, or some conflict with what the document states versus what we're supposed to be using to teach the public.
Jenny, as we wrap up, since we have you here, you're a registered dietitian. What's the best advice you generally give people for diet?
The best advice that I give people for diet or for health is to start with the lowest hanging fruit. Your health is not made or broken by a single meal or by a single action, but rather what you do consistently over the long term. So, the best thing that you can do for your health is start with the lowest hanging fruit. Start with the thing that is the absolute easiest for you to implement into your daily life. Let that become habit, let that become second nature, and then go for the next lowest hanging fruit. And just rinse and repeat and do these things consistently over time. You will get so much better improvement in your health and your nutrition status if you do that, rather than if you follow some sort of fad diet or crash diet for 12 weeks, fall off the wagon because it's too difficult, and then have to start all over again.
And when you look into the landscape of social media, what are your thoughts there? 'Cause we all know that's a prime environment for fad diets.
Yeah, discerning correct nutrition information or correct health information is really difficult. And like we mentioned, registered dietitians are the nutrition professionals, but there's millions of people out there marketing themselves as nutritionists online. And, usually what I recommend is look at the marketing techniques. Everybody who is promoting some sort of like catchy thing with nutrition or health are going to be doing approximately the same thing. They're going to start with some sort of kernel of truth that's going to make whatever they say sound plausible. Then they're going to do something called pain point marketing, or I call it shame marketing. So they're going to make you feel bad, feel inadequate, or feel envious of something that they're saying in order to reel you in. Then they're going to promise that they have the solution to fix all your problems. And then they're going to try to sell you that solution. At the end of the day, nutrition is very nuanced and health is very nuanced. It's very hard to say something that is like going to sell something or going to make you notable or make you an influencer that is truly going to impact nutrition for millions of Americans. Nutrition is not sexy. The things that we are doing for our health are not really sexy. And if it sounds like they're trying to tell you or sell you something, they probably are. And just in general, if there was some sort of thing that would magically make millions of Americans healthy, I can guarantee you that your medical team is not keeping that a secret from you. We want you to be healthy.
Well, Jenny Lowe, thanks again for joining us today to talk about the new dietary guidelines. Is there anything that you want listeners to know about what you got going on as far as wellness and sports dietetics?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a registered dietitian located in Virginia Beach. I have an insurance-based nutrition practice. So if you're in Virginia and you're looking for somebody to cut through the noise of diet culture and help you be your absolute healthiest, please feel free to look me up. Otherwise, there are millions of dietitians out there who accept health insurance to help you get the healthiest with your nutrition needs. And so I definitely recommend making sure that you're following the right people and following the right content creators so that you can cut through the noise.
Yeah, so you're not doing TikTok dances currently?
No, I am not. That would be very embarrassing.
Well, Jenny Lowe, thanks again for joining us today on Health Affairs This Week. And if you, the listener, enjoyed this episode, please send it to a friend. And with that, we'll see you next week.
Thanks, guys.